Hello and welcome to our continued webinar series today on back to school after COVID-19. Today we'll be addressing student social and emotional needs. And we're very pleased to have with us Micki Moran and Dr. Ruth Kraus. Micki is a partner with the law firm of Grundon Levitt. She is a founding partner of the Child and Family Law Center and has dedicated her practice to representing children and families in special education, mental health, juvenile matters, DCFS defense, and in divorce and parenting matters. Many of you who work with parents in special education know Micki from her representation of your students and your families, and her perspective is we always find very valuable in helping to guide and understand what the parent perspective is and what parent representatives and legal counsel are thinking. Dr. Ruth Kraus is a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice. She conducts psychological evaluations for school districts. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work through IEEs or receiving reports. She also does reports for families and has dedicated, or evaluations for families, and dedicated a significant part of her practice in working with students with anxiety diagnosis and school refusal problems. Want to let everyone know before we get started, we will be continuing our webinar series next week with a session, a global Q&A on a variety of school opening topics with our regular panelists, who will also be joined by our partner Aristelianis. So we'll have a nice breadth of legal experience to answer all your questions. Before we get started today, I wanted to remind you that you can submit questions. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your tools. That will allow us to flag your questions, and we'll start off with questions we received through registration and a variety of topics we've discussed in preparation, and then we very much do want to answer your questions, so please do submit those. To get us started, I wanted to ask everyone, what are we hearing from our clients? What is everyone hearing from our clients in regards to questions and concerns about students returning to school? And so to get us started, Micki, what are you hearing?
Well, I would say probably the number one question I get at least several times a day is, what are schools going to be doing in the fall? And when will we know? And I don't have a crystal ball, and it's such a constantly evolving situation that I'm actually trying to educate myself every day to figure out what's going to happen. And schools are beginning to say they will issue guidance soon. So parents are anxiously awaiting some clarity. And part of it is the websites and the calendars have not been updated. So the expectations are that things will be returning, but I think it's still very much a fluid situation.
Ruth, what about you? What are you hearing?
Well, I'm seeing, everyone is anxious. Parents really are anxious with the lack of knowledge about what's going to be happening in the fall. And even parents who are not typically anxious are experiencing anxiety about this. But I think with anxious kids, there's almost, you have a perfect storm. So when you think about anxiety, anyone with anxiety, there's two things that anxiety really focuses on, and one is predictability. Anxiety wants predictability, wants to know what's going to happen. Kids with anxiety can be very rigid, and if they don't know what's going to happen, they have a real hard time. And then the second one is safety and comfort. And kids and parents with anxiety worry a lot about their own safety, about their comfort level. And so you put COVID on top of this, and it's like the exact two things that just feed right into that anxiety. It's the unpredictable nature, not just of, who's going to get it, who's not going to get it, but also of what's going to happen, what's school going to look like. And then you have the safety issues that people and kids just aren't feeling safe. And when you put those two together, I think it's going to cause a lot of problems for kids getting back to school who are on that sort of anxious, especially the anxious school refuser kids.
Dana, what about you? What are you hearing?
So I think on the special ed front, I think we're getting many questions about how special ed may fit in to a school district individual return plan. So if we have a school district that's contemplating just coming back remote again, and they're revisiting their remote learning plans and looking at ways to make them more robust, how is that meaningful for our special ed population? Do we need to update IEPs? Do we need to adjust goals? And of course, in the special ed sort of setting, the IEP drives everything. So it is very individualized. You know, there's also been questions about what do we do if we're running a hybrid program and, you know, only half the kids are coming every day. Can half the special ed kids come every day? And can we keep them at home for part of the time? And I do think that's sort of a confusing point because the ISB guidance really recommends to maximize the in-person opportunities for the special ed population. So in response to that, we're seeing districts making maybe separate plans for certain groups of special ed students, especially the students that Ruth is going to talk about today, the ED students, and students who are more profoundly disabled, who are sort of more low incidence disabilities that really did not respond well or did not respond ideally to that first round of remote education. So just questions around all the different plans and how do special ed students fit and how do we keep serving them no matter what we determine to do.
Agreed, and I'm also hearing more questions around logistics, expecting an onslaught of, for example, initial case study evaluations. How are we going to staff those? We have evaluations that weren't complete from the spring because of the closure. So now we need our teams to not only do those, but expect a new wave, you know, and just the logistics of how are we going to manage this?
Yeah, the
So
staff needs are huge, I think. And there's also that whole, which Ruth sort of touched on, when you do a different thing, that different needs arise, right? So a student that was really fine with remote learning last spring and now everyone's coming back, they might not be so fine anymore. And you might have additional child find issues that arise from that.
Right. I think what is going to happen, and I don't have a crystal ball, but this is just my sense, dovetailing off of what you said, Dana, is that especially the kids who are more socially anxious, perhaps, or more hesitant to even leave the house. So a lot of these kids, what I've noticed, have just been very happy with remote learning. They don't have to deal with a lot of what is going to trigger their anxiety, all that social stuff, gym, the lunchroom, you know, the hallways, sitting in a class. They're happy in their pajamas, in their bed with their dogs and their bowls of spaghetti, and they can just do their thing. And so it's going to be doubly, because we know the more kids who are anxious, the more they're allowed to avoid what makes them anxious, the harder it is to get them back. So I think there's going to have to be, for schools that are opening in person or have some in-person learning, a real effort to get these kids back into school and back into more of a social milieu with their peers whenever possible.
well, following up on that, Ruth, what can districts do to prepare? What are the things that you would do to support a kid knowing that they're going to struggle, perhaps, or anticipating a struggle with returning to in-person? What should they be thinking about?
So I think having first, you know, social work services with a real solid curriculum geared towards anxiety. We know that for anxiety, exposure and response prevention is basically one of the standards of treatment. So exposure is really getting them back into school and then helping them tolerate the distress of being in school without, you know, jumping off the walls. So that's one thing, is having the social workers prepared to deal with a lot of these issues. And then things like, just in terms of predictability, having them maybe come back early before school starts to look at the setup of the classroom, to see where they're going to be sitting, to see what measures the school has taken to keep kids safe and as much as possible. And parents, you know, we know anxious kids, anxious parents. So a lot of these parents are also driving some of this.
I would like to say a few things to follow up on that. So, you know, I work with a lot of kids with anxiety disorders, and many of them have anxiety disorders for different reasons. Some of them have real, you know, they have difficult family situations, or they, you know, they are on the autism spectrum, or, you know, a variety of things. The thing that I felt like really has to be a little more robust if we go to remote, or at least, you know, some remote, is the connection with a social worker. And really making sure that we're front loading that support, because I don't know that that happened, and I don't say that with any blame, because we were all trying to figure it out, you know. But now, having learned some lessons, just making sure these kids stay connected, because if they don't stay connected, we're going to lose them. Even if the academics suffer a bit, the connection is really critical. I have kids who just have quit doing anything. Okay, they just aren't engaged in any way whatsoever. And a once a week social work call is probably not sufficient. And so whatever we can do to maintain a sense of belonging and community in this very difficult time, I think is essential.
So Micki, what if anything did work for your clients? I know that's a struggle as we retool, if we do have to stay remote. Were there things that you heard positive feedback that were better strategies for connecting? The social work call is one that you mentioned, obviously, is a good one.
It worked better with younger kids than it did with my teenage kids, who weren't usually out of bed when the social worker called. Or didn't prioritize it as something they needed to do. I think like planned activities, maybe a structure around the call, some sort of curriculum. And I use that word loosely because there's no one curriculum for every kid. But, you know, getting an engagement in a hands-on way, which sounds kind of crazy in a remote situation. But I think that feeling like this is really something belong to will be critical.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we've always had some teachers that are very creative, and we need to make sure that we're connecting with those types of teachers, because I do think this requires out of the box thinking in terms of how to, I mean, I was a teacher for several years, and there used to be an educational guru, years ago, William Glassner, I think was his name. Right. You've got to make it in the kids' quality world. You've got to find a lesson that relates to the kids' quality world. And the quality world right now might be, you know, a show on Netflix. It might be some kooky TikTok video that they're all watching. It might be, you know, they've taken up a hobby. They're cooking things. But you have to find what that is and rely on those people. We do have people in public schools that excel at this. We need to find them and connect them so that they can share those ideas.
Dana, we had a question come in about, and let me read it, that do we think that there will need to be a reaffirmation around the consistency of the definition of emotional disability? Colleagues in special education, this person says, I and my colleagues anticipate more push from a district to diagnose, even though there's been a lack of consistency in schedule, you know, ambitious instruction, and there is a sense in the temporary nature perhaps of the anxiety. What do you think about, and I have some thoughts, I've gotten this question from clients too. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I have thoughts, and I'd also like to hear from you and from our panel here, because I think this is going to, I mean, we've talked about this sort of before we got on the camera, but it's normal for people to react with anxiety to what has been happening. And I think that's the question that many school districts have when they're trying to make eligibility determinations is, how do we have consistent eligibility determinations and make people, you know, where do we do accommodations that are not formalized through either an RTI process or through a curricular process or through just, temporary services. The social workers and the counselors are usually staffed to just sort of have that intake, that if there's an off the street person walk in, we can service them, versus how do we make someone eligible for special ed services? And I think that's a really hard question in this time, because as Ruth so aptly pointed out in the beginning, parents are stressed, kids are stressed. You talk to your neighbors across the street, they're stressed. So I think that's a good question. I'd like to hear I think you do have to have some standards, but
yeah, and there is part of the criteria is the period of time of
right.
distress of the condition. So if it's only for, now we're getting to the point where this is 6 months
Right.
that we've been experiencing, which is usually kind of the general benchmark for a long enough period. But Ruth, what were you gonna say?
Well, so a couple things. I mean, 6 months, but the kids who are truly like anxious and socially anxious have not been exposed to what distresses them, which may be the school building and the whatever, piece of schooling is stressful for them. So they really haven't been displaying the same symptoms they might when they get to school. But I also think that, taking more of an RTI approach even to this. So for example, putting together groups for kids who, voluntarily, or whose parents want to have them participate, or teachers who see some of these problems, even if it's online groups or in-person groups, to really do it, really talk about anxiety with them, to really go over, what it is, normalize it, let parents and kids know that everybody is feeling, and teachers, everybody's feeling similarly. This isn't pathological. This is a normal response to a really difficult situation. So providing those kinds of services and seeing if kids, there's the large majority of kids for whom this is situational anxiety are going to respond to that type of intervention, versus the kids who are really going to have more significant levels of distress and behaviors that then are going to trigger maybe an evaluation for higher level services.
Jen, when we look at the criteria for emotional disorder, it's unusual feelings under, normal circumstances, like atypical reactions, and under normal circumstances. Well, we've not had any normal circumstances since February, early March. So I think, I'm less concerned about the rush to become, to label kids emotionally disordered, or I'm more concerned about making sure that we front load social work services, even over offer social work services, to get kids back in the building and to try to calm the entire community of kids, as opposed to we're going to have a floodgate of kids who flipped out over the COVID period.
Right, and there are that certain, there's sort of this subset of sort of general ed kids who are going to be, some are going to be anxious, or their parents are going to be anxious, but it should be dealt with pretty easily with just some real minor interventions. Then there's going to be kids who we know that stress can trigger psychiatric disorders. It can trigger genetic things to become expressed that might not have been expressed where there hasn't been stress. So it may be that we're going to be seeing a lot more really true anxiety disorders or emotional disturbances because they've been triggered by this stressful period that we've all been through. Like, people have different levels of resiliency and different ways of responding to these situations.
I also want to say one thing that I just was thinking about, because I was talking to my neighbor who's a teacher this morning about going back. There are people who have lost their jobs. There are kids who are the families having dire economic straits, even on in the North Shore, all around, everywhere. It's record numbers of unemployment, and they may have family who are vulnerable at home. So it's not just the there's so many moving parts to this and so many situational stressors that not just, we could sort of put under the COVID umbrella, which of course is accurate, but each family has had some, has different impacts. And I think recognizing that kids who never got free lunch may need to have lunch provided, or won't be able to buy school supplies, so things like that because of family finances.
And I want to add to that, which is important to think about, people have lost their health insurance when they've lost their jobs. And so they've lost access to private mental health services that they might have had access to prior. So they may no longer be able to go see a private therapist or a psychiatrist to work on some of these issues. So I would encourage school districts to partner, to partner with their community mental health centers and to really maybe develop some sort of way to, when they see these kids really falling apart, when the schools see it, to get those referrals sooner rather than later to the community mental health centers. And those are the places that they're going to be able to find the treatment that they need at the price or the scale, or they take Medicaid for these families that have lost their insurance.
Well, we've all kind of alluded to it, but what the situation is presenting is a lot of uncertainty. And, even if there's a plan going into the school year, we anticipate there's going to be changes, or there may even be changes to the plan before the school year ever starts. What is the best way to support your community in coping with such massive changes of circumstance around schooling? Do you have any ideas, Ruth?
In terms of supporting
supporting when you're changing, when you're messaging. So now you're in person, now you're remote, now you go for half the day. How are we going to support these anxious kids when, like you said, not just a change from the spring, but maybe a change during the course of the school year?
And parents who have to, again, readjust their work schedules and again, figure out how they're going to do the homeschooling and the supports that all the remote learning is requiring. Well, I think there's two kind of prongs. One is to make things as predictable as possible. So once the schools knows what's going on, immediately being able to communicate that with the parents, because as we know, when we don't know what's happening, we spin out of control to the worst case scenario pretty quickly. So helping people not do that. But then the other prong is, and this is for everyone, this is just everybody is working so hard to tolerate high levels of unpredictability and distress. And again, and the teachers as well. So to help providing, and I know you can't provide services to parents, but providing those kinds of referrals to outside providers, community mental health centers, and to provide the children with practice on distress tolerance. So they need to learn how to tolerate these high levels of unpredictability and these high levels of distress. And it's a lot of social work, and it's just a lot of work on the school's part.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the challenges, and I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think one of the challenges is it's summer right now too. And traditionally school districts really, slow down in the summer. We run ESY, but we don't have our full staff. Teachers aren't being paid for work that they do in the summer. And I think there's certainly budgetary pressures that, somewhat drive some of this. But I also think that to be proactive for some of these complaints, like, just even when we don't know things, having certain staff members as touch points for families. I know, Micki, you'd mentioned that. Even if you have a few students that the cases are acute cases, and it's been a lot to manage during the regular school year, I do a lot of teacher contracts, to pay somebody $40 or $50 for an hour of work, and 2 half-hour check-ins might be a good investment to prevent a lot of legal challenge later, or just hard feelings that can lead to legal challenge later. So I do think it's something for districts to, like, we know that you can't have finality on everything. Like, that is just not possible with how rapidly things are changing in the communities. But thinking about how to use those services. I know people have been doing webinars, school districts have been doing webinars or informational sessions. I think those are also good tools.
So one of the logistical issues is when a lot of this comes to the districts through referrals in the form of doctor's notes. So Dana, maybe you could get us started with, we expect that will be the communication chain. We'll get, parents will come in with a doctor's note that says whatever it says. How are you guiding districts on how to address that?
So for districts that are planning to come back in some sort of form where everyone is going to be in the school building, you might get, or you will likely get, doctor's notes from people who are just not comfortable with that. Now, some of them are going to be people that you know of already, and those are going to be really valid doctor's notes. We were talking earlier about kids on trachs, kids that have chronic medical conditions that compromise their immune systems. You are clearly going to have to accommodate for those students under Section 504 if they're not IDEA eligible already. The other sort of group of people that you're going to get writing doctor's notes are the people that are just fearful to come back. And those could come in 2 ways. They could just be a blanket doctor's note saying, I have some unspecified health condition. We were seeing last week or the week before, there are some fake cards that are being distributed in communities. One of them is from the U.S. Department of Justice. One of them had some Illinois agency on it, and I think a little silhouette of Lincoln that just says, I don't have to wear a mask and you can't ask me why, and you can't. And these things aren't valid. We do need to have a medical excuse of why someone can't come into the building. So, and that was about masks, but we have to have these medical excuses, and I think we are going to have to accommodate where the excuses are valid, where they're not valid. And I think this is the reason we're anticipating this deluge of, and I don't want to say not valid, because people are genuinely, I don't want to judge, people are generally worried and they might have valid reasons to do that. That's a bad term. But if there's no documented medical condition, that's, I think, why the districts are having the choice program. So we have districts that are saying, if you really are not comfortable coming back, here is a program that you can do remotely. We're not going to require you to have a doctor's note. It is just by choice. So those programs, I think, will minimize how many doctor's notes we have to go through. And I think that will be helpful. But those programs might not be good for kids that are anxious.
And I thought, Ruth, I was
really
thinking about you. And
that's the case too, is if you give kids with school refusal because of anxiety, you give them green light not to go to school. When school does open, it's going to make it that much harder for them to come back, I think. So one way to look at it is to think about working with the parents. If you know this is a kid who is opting out of coming back, when there's an opt-out because of anxiety that goes beyond just that, I have my mom is going through chemo and I don't want to go and, bring something back into the house. That it's kids who are really those anxious avoidant, because it's the whole thing is you don't want to teach kids to avoid things that make them uncomfortable. You want to teach them to deal with them and be resilient. So when you know that this is a kid who is not coming back because of real avoidance or social anxiety, maybe work with the parent on having what you would do with the typical kid who's avoidant, which is, come for an hour, sit and, you know, play cards with the social worker or whatever, come sit with an adult, a comfortable adult that you feel good with. So to sort of give that gradual exposure to getting them back into school, rather than sort of giving in to that anxiety that says, I can't do this, this is too hard for me.
So I'm going to say something that I thought, and I think we've spoken about this. I know no one would have wanted this to be the case, but this has been the reason for the shift. I think we're going to see a sea change in the way we deliver services academically to students. I think this is opening the door to kind of more options in education. And and as we have all discussed, our practices have changed. You're watching me sitting in my home office. I would have never dreamed 7 months ago that I would have spent the last 5 months here. But now I realize I can do this. It works. And I think you're going to find parents and kids realize that for many kids it's not a good option, but for some kids it is. And I think the hybrid model will also be of interest. And I think we're going to start to see a fundamental shift in education. I know that's a big, nugget to talk about, but I just do think that this is changing how we look at what kids do, and brick and mortar buildings are going to, the notion that that's the only way to deliver an educational model, I think is going to shift profoundly as a result.
That's what's really hard about, I think, what I hear Ruth saying and what I hear about the treatment for anxiety. It's going to be hard. I don't know that districts are in a position to push families in that way at this time. I mean, if a family opts out, we're going to give a remote, some are going to have a remote option. If the family selects that's best for their family right now, even if we know that, hey, for this kid, actually the benefit would be to get them in school and to address the anxiety long-term is going to be, the balance of risks and benefits is going to be better had we pushed that kid. But I don't think we have the bandwidth right now to sort through who should and shouldn't be exercising this option. Sadly. And when you say that education changed, I mean, so now, like you said, some of those kids who are doing fine remotely, that's not going to be questioned. They're doing fine remotely, I don't know, Dana, if you think anyone will be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we will have the bandwidth to go through each and every excuse, which is why I think this option of allowing people to opt in to online instruction, I don't know what that's going to mean for us long term. Certainly in the college and university era, that's going to impact their bottom lines a lot. But I also just wonder what it's going to do to, some of the things that we teach in social emotional learning are like just positive interactions with others, and how much positive interactions with others are a critical part of student success in academically. And like for transition, like it's great that you got an A+ in geometry, but if you cannot talk to the person next to you for more than a second, and I wonder if that skill is still going to be relevant if we're all online all of the time, or if some things will just to transition so much online that this will be a new area that we're going to have to teach, accommodate, it's just a different way that we're going to have to put all the scaffolding and all the supports that we have in our old way and attach it to this new way. And I do think that's, if we go to a full remote again, that is going to be the task, because they've given us no relief on any of the special ed mandates. So if we're back in remote, we have to find ways to accommodate and deliver special ed services through remote means. There's no other choice at this point.
And so another one of the biggest areas of controversy, or where we've gotten the most questions, is around face mask tolerance, supporting families around face masks, the social emotional impact of face masks. I just raise all face mask issues now. I don't know, Dana, if you want to get us started, but with what do we do if we have a student refusing to wear a face mask?
So I think we start with the ISB guidance on face masks, and the ISB guidance, and which is based on the Illinois Department of Public Health guidance, is that everyone is wearing a face mask unless they have a medical excuse not to wear a face mask. And if you, and that means staff, that means students. If you go on the IDPH's website, they'll talk about exceptions for kids younger than 2. They talk about exceptions for people with severe physical disabilities who cannot remove the masks without assistance, you know, and then they talk about people with cognitive impairments or mental illness that might be affected by the masks, and it might cause a detriment to them. But they're not saying that sensory issues are an excuse necessarily. They're not saying, you know, asthma would be a common, people are saying, I have asthma. You know, the Department of Public Health has not said that that's an excuse, and there's been literature on the American Lung Association's website from their physicians that is generally not an excuse not to wear a mask. So I think you're going to see school districts really severely, you know, we have to allow excusals like everything, but really severely monitoring that, because staff are not going to want to come back with students who aren't wearing masks. So I know there's been a lot of talk. I'm curious, Ruth, we didn't talk about this before, but just how teachers with masks will stunt children's development at certain ages. And that's been, so I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
I don't know that there's any research to support that. So I don't even think, you know, kids are pretty able to, you know, and I know that, you know, it's possible to just take your mask down for a second, see, here's my face, and then put the mask up and everybody sees your face. And kids are able to maintain that image in their mind, and for the most part. But I want to get back to the point of when you think about face masks and kids refusing to wear face masks because of sensory issues. So when you look at needs, educational needs, one of the things, if this face mask thing is going to be with us for a while, these kids need to learn how to tolerate a face mask, or else they're not going to be able to go out into the community at all. So having people trained and doing ABA interventions to teach kids to tolerate face masks, I think could be a real helpful thing to do, not just to say, you can't wear a face mask, oh well, because now face masks are really, you have to be able to tolerate those. So it's really a need when you look at it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think looking at things like that too, I mean, you have to, there's a long list of things you have to go through before can't, right? There's a long, I think what Elastic did for pants, Elastic could certainly do something for face masks too. So, I mean, looking at the different, you know, different models, like if the ear straps bother them, looking at something that's more of a solid piece of fabric, or, I mean, I think there's a lot of accommodations that special ed teams need to think about, and our psychologists, our behavior therapists, our social workers, our special ed teachers that works with, you know, populations that tend to have more sensory concerns. We should be putting, you know, these people should be getting together now to sort of working through a menu of accommodations and modifications that you can make while still facilitating mask wearing. Because that is part of the job of a special educator, is to get these things that we have to do generalized so that the kids can, I mean, that's in the law, so that the kids can fully participate in our society. And that means going to Walmart, you know, walking, going to the grocery store, doing things like that with their families.
I work with a pretty high percentage of kids with very severe disabilities. And that has come up in terms of what are we going to do, because there's not a chance in, you know, the world that my daughter is going to wear that mask, okay, for more than 2 seconds. These are younger kids too, maybe even older kids. But I think, you know, there's models out of California and different, for very severe kids, classroom models that don't mandate masks. It's more reliant on social distancing, if that's even possible with this group. But I think that the real clarification is if a 3-year-old keeps taking their mask off, I mean, I don't know the answer to this question. I'm just posing it. What are we going to do about that? I mean, or if the kid just will not wear a mask no matter what, without having a complete and total breakdown, which, by the way, does kind of impact social distancing when you're trying to do seclusion or restraint. So that they don't hurt themselves. So I think those are the really tough questions. Not whether the typical 3rd graders can we get them to wear masks, but for the populations who are very challenging and very impaired, how is that actually going to get addressed in reality?
I mean, Micki, I've been talking to clients about this. I think it's going to be some really hard IEP meetings where maybe we change placements. I mean, maybe the in-school, as much as that student could benefit from in-person, it's not safe. If they won't wear a mask, if they can't social distance, if they need physical restraint, which obviously, if they're spitting on staff, if they're scratching at staff, at some point, that's not safe for the student, that's not safe for the staff. And I think we're going to have to do some hard placement changes. I mean, hopefully some parents will also see it as unsafe, and it will be a collaborative, okay, we're going to have to work something out at home. It's going to be a home placement, which is on the continuum. We had one question about what about therapeutic day placements. I mean, I agree that will be discussed, but these issues cannot be addressed anymore. That they don't have any more tools in their toolkit than the public schools do around if a student's needs are such, you cannot maintain the 6 feet, you cannot maintain PPE. I'm afraid, I just think that's where we're going to have to go with some of these for now. As much as, I mean, we're prioritizing those kids' needs. We know we need to prioritize the needs of students with special, with IEPs, but I think it's unsafe. I mean, at a certain point, it can't be accommodated. I don't know, I think maybe we'll be at a table one day discussing some of these issues, truly.
Yeah, I think there's just and there is such an incongruence between ISB saying getting everyone in the building, but then part of that population just having these very severe needs that make it impossible for them to really be educated safely under the conditions that we're faced with. And you have to health and safety has got to be first. And we're not going to have a perfect solution for this. It may be that, we catch up on things later. And that's the way we have to do it.
Yeah, one thing I am talking to districts about is I don't think, we haven't seen some of these kids in person for six months now. So I don't know that we should be assuming based on their last IEP necessarily that some of these things are impossible. I mean, is there an alternative, before we had physical restraint in the IEP, maybe they can come back now and that need can be met by some other strategy that doesn't involve breaching the 6 feet regularly. I think we might have to try that and collect some data before we're changing placements. But these are going to be hard decisions.
Absolutely.
So, one other thing that we talked about in preparation is maybe lessons learned from our experience with remote learning, if it goes that way again. Are there things that that now, the new and improved remote learning for the fall? Ruth, can you think of anything you would put out there for districts to think about?
Well, yeah, one of the things that has struck me, and probably people who have done remote learning with these students, is there are a large number of kids who struggle with remote learning due to executive function issues, and there's a lot more independence, I think, expected from kids during remote learning than when they're in person in the classroom, and there's a lot more support expected from parents. So the parents are the ones who have to make sure they're not just doing their homework, but they're doing their actual classroom work as well, things that they would ordinarily do within the classroom setting. And you have kids with executive function problems, and you have parents with executive function problems. So it's kind of like the blind leading the blind, and no one can kind of figure out what to prioritize, how to get the work done, how to manage time, how to get the kids off of screens, and all of that stuff. So, and I've talked to parents, it's a full-time job, really. If you have more than one kid on remote learning and you're trying to make sure they're all doing this, and they have, 1 hour a day of instruction maybe, and then packets and packets and packets to do, I think that's a problem. So there has to be some way either to make sure that in remote learning, they are in the school, website learning for larger chunks of the day, but also to provide executive function support to the kids and the parents, and maybe help, I've talked to parents who said, I don't know how to do this with my kid. I don't understand. And I don't know, there's just so much here and it's too much. And so to help, knowing that the parents are going to be doing a lot of the supporting and a lot of the sort of educating, to provide a direct instruction to parents as well as the kids in terms of do this.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dana.
I really see this as like, we need to maintain teacher supervision even though we're in remote learning.
Mm-hmm.
I had so many cases where it just took a little bit of intervention, but you have these young, adorable, go-getter teachers like teaching second grade that just want to put every valuable second grade experience in front of these second graders. But then what you end up with, because they don't have the experience in the classroom as much as the teachers that are more experienced and seasoned, is you have a second grade class that really takes more time to get through than contracts or torts in law school, which is a no, because those things the books are like this fat, and Micki knows and Jennifer knows it takes a long time to read. The print is very fine. So we shouldn't have second graders, I think, just thinking about their developmental level and how long they can sustain attention, and thinking about that for all kids. It's not going to, I worry that a little bit about doing a lot of the class is going to keep going and you're just going to log on. That's great if you're 19 and you're, in your sophomore year at U of I. It might not be so great if you're 13. You just may not be able to keep up that way. So I think we need to think about that and how to, because some of our role, I think, as school attorneys is to prevent issues before they happen. And I think that's an area where we could learn some lessons to prevent parent frustration and complaint.
Micki, what are you thinking?
Well, one of the things, I think we're in a better position to prioritize what is important, okay? And in terms of learning, this isn't going to be the same experience as if we were in the building full time. So what must kids learn during, second grade math? I mean, what are the first semester of second grade math? What do we hope for, and what's the range? And then for other kids, sort of out of the box solutions, like we talked about the blended program, but I have kids using computer-based programs like Edgenuity. I'm using that as an example. For some kids, that's worked very nicely. For other kids, it's been a disaster. But they've also combined those with some video or Zoom classes. So I think the notion that one size fits all, even for kids without IEPs, I think, and letting parents know what the priority is. So if you're faced with 5 hours of learning that day, and the parents want to tear their hair out because the kid is, laying on the carpet saying, I'm never doing this again, to figure out what is essential for that week to master and then move on. I mean, not to be personal, but I homeschooled my son for a while. And at first I did it I was, Miss Susie's second grade classroom. And then you pretty much realize that you have to prioritize what you want to get done during the day, that, attention wise and everything. It's a lot harder to do it in your home when you don't have the entertainment of a group of other second graders going. So maybe helping parents figure that out and having more parent contact during the, once a week, once every 2 weeks, like Mrs. Smith's second grade classroom parents meeting at 3 o'clock or 5 o'clock on Tuesdays, and for them to kind of download that experience with the parents and see if it can be improved. That's just my thought.
Micki, kind of following up on if all of this doesn't work well, a lot of districts we've heard about compensatory service and kind of it's this boulder that's running, rolling behind all of our special educators. How are we ever gonna make all this up? Do we have to make it up? What do we have to make up? Have you been getting, what have you heard from your clients, or what are you hearing in the parents' bar on compensatory services?
There's been a lot of noise about compensatory services. I always, and certainly I'm sure there'll be plenty of places where schools did not do a good job of delivering regardless of, but I think people did as much as they could most of the time. I do think we're going to have to compensate, and I use that word a little bit more loosely than the legal term, to figure out how to bring kids back and bring them up to speed, because even typical kids had regression and didn't learn some of the essentials. So I think one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of advising my clients is maybe doing assessments, and I'm using that word sort of broadly, but to figure out where they're at, because we haven't had that option. I'm not talking map testing or any of that. I'm just talking about what did they learn from second grade math? And if they didn't learn certain things, then how do we figure out how to build that in so they don't end up in problems down the road? I tend to think of compensatory as more broadly. I think the trickier cases are where kids did not get related services like speech or OT or PT. Those things I think will have to be addressed in a different way. I do think schools might have to figure out a way to, I don't even want to use the word double up, but because we don't use an hour-to-hour measure in the Seventh Circuit, it's qualitative. But figuring out how to catch kids up, I think, will be a real issue whenever the time comes. But I haven't seen that being prioritized by schools right now as, oh, we're going to, see where they're at when we come back. I think people are just trying to figure out how we can get them back.
Fair point. I think that is the focus so far. Ruth, do you have any thoughts on, is there even a way one makes up, addressing anxiety at a later time? Can that be postponed?
Well, I wouldn't want to postpone that, but I think, if you're trying to prioritize what to work on, if you only have, X amount of time or X amount of resources to work on something with these kids, for the kids who have, ED and anxiety, or kids who are on IEPs, to really focus on those what word am I looking for? The services, social work, speech language, OT, that those are things that I think academics can be caught up. They can catch up with the academics. But the important stuff, what's really going to make a difference for them, is making sure that they're working on those factors that are really keeping them from accessing education in a less restrictive setting. So it's really things like the emotional piece of things, or the speech language piece of things. And those I would say should be the priorities when you're trying to figure out what to really focus on with these kids. Is those are things that, it's not like math that you learn it and you're going to learn it. These are things that have to be worked on, over and over again.
Yeah. We did get one question. If an IEP team recommends home instruction as the placement, would the district be obligated to provide an in-home staff member as part of that? I'll start off with an answer of this. No, I guess if the reason, I think there's so many reasons one might end up with a homebound placement at this point, and it's really separate from whatever your remote learning plan is. Although I think you can blend the two of them also. So if a student has an IEP placement for home, and the reason is because it's unsafe, they can't interact with a staff member in a safe way, then no, we're not going to send someone to the home. Or, you know, really, we always try to avoid that literal in-home service as much as we can. In some, you know, severe cases, we do send people to the home. We're going to have to think about, but still those same protocols as far as 6 feet of distance, PPE, if that couldn't be maintained at school, and that's the reason for the home placement, it couldn't be maintained. Now, I do think we can use our remote, if we have a remote option, and the student who's on homebound as an IEP placement could benefit for that as a component, great. I think actually this gives us an increased flexibility, like Micki was saying. I mean, we can really think about home placements differently, because we're not literally just talking about an hour a day exclusively, you know, to make up homework, basically, which is a lot of times what it means. Now we actually have a full, robust, perhaps, program that we can supplement with some related services remotely. And it could be something a lot different than we traditionally think of as homebound. Dana, do you have any other thoughts on changing placements?
I think that, yeah, generally if they're being kept out of school because it's unsafe for them to be around others and they can't wear PPE, we're not going to send someone home to be in that same situation. But I mean, I guess we have to remind ourselves that just because we're dealing with these COVID issues, people are still going to need to have homebound service because they, you know, are out on their skateboard and they break both legs, or they, God forbid, but, you know, we still have requests that are coming in for different reasons. And, you know, those we have to take as we get them and determine individually what the services are going to be. But I do agree that if you have a remote program, it does, the benefit to that, I know some districts aren't doing it, and if that's a choice, I support that choice, but it just gives you a whole nother variety of options for your special ed population that you might not have had. So it can really make things easier in that way.
This got a little tricky in the spring and in the summer. So I had kids with 3-year-olds who, you know, there was no learning in person. There was no option. So they wanted someone to come into the house. Well, you know, if the teachers can't go into the building, it's my opinion that they can't go into someone's house. I mean, if it's a statewide closure, you know, or if the district's not sending anybody in, you know, to any, I mean, in any buildings, they're not going to your house. That became a real tricky issue. And also for kids with severe disabilities, who there was no way they could really engage in remote learning. And there was no way this district was going to send someone into the house to support. So I think the question depends on how global the shutdown is. And maybe we can have itinerant people go into people's houses. You know, I'm signing you guys up for this. If, you know, if we have that flexibility, maybe you designate people who would fill that role. And I'm sure that, you know, schools need to add another thing like that to their plate, like they want a hole in the head. But again, the model's gonna, I think, have to be much more flexible than we've ever really had to deal with in the past.
Well, great. We're just a few minutes from wrapping up. Is there any last thoughts that from Micki or Ruth about thinking about kids with anxiety ED as we venture into the fall?
So I noticed that there's some questions about curriculum for kids with anxiety, for school social workers. Does everyone have my email? Is that like part of the, I don't know when it went out to the attendees, but feel free to email me, or if you don't have it, you can email Jennifer or Dana, and they'll send it to me and I can get back to you on some of those. And also I think the key to all of this is going to be a lot of work with the parents, more work with the parents than schools, I think, are used to doing, because that's where you're going to have, that's the make it or break it. I think what's going to really work is working with the parents.
Micki, any last thoughts?
I echo that. I think we have to think of this as a community effort, and the notion that we're all in this together. as opposed to as compartmentalized as we have in some ways in the past.
Great. Well, thank you both for participating today. Again, we invite everyone back next Thursday to talk about broader reopening issues, and thank you for attending today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Buddy.